All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. Before we start, I will review some logistics. If you've been with us throughout this series, you've likely heard this. So thank you for your patience as we acclimate our new participants. This talk is being recorded. We are offering this talk in Spanish. Speakers, we ask that you speak slowly and one at a time to capture the translation. I am now going to ask our student assistant, Flor, to please announce and add instructions to the chat for the Spanish call line.
Hola, buenas tardes. Si necesita asistencia en español, contamos con una llamada en vivo donde traducimos toda la información de la videollamada. El número es 605-313-4434 y después ingresa el código 829406. Las instrucciones también están en el chat. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Flor. You've been so outstanding throughout this entire series. We can't thank you enough for all that you do. Thank you, thank you. Please mute yourself if you are not speaking. We are taking questions throughout the session and we'll answer them at the end of the panel. Please utilize the chat on Zoom or ask the Spanish moderator. This talk will be posted on our YouTube channel and Twitter account at UCLA Pritzker within the next week. A note on geography. We are based at UCLA in Los Angeles, California. The majority of our work revolves around the LA County child welfare system. However, we know that folks are joining us from across the United States and in some cases from Canada. We will do our best to share information that is relevant to all jurisdictions. With that in mind, we invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat. Please feel free to tell us your organization, your role, and why you joined today's session. Now for introductions. On behalf of the UCLA Pritzker Center, my name is Taylor Dudley. You will see our production team, Ruby, Flor, Nicole, and Brittany assisting throughout the event. Please feel free to write them in the chat should you need any assistance. Welcome to the UCLA Pritzker Center's Winter Speaker Series on Domestic Violence and Child Welfare. This work is funded by the Anthony and Jeannie Pritzker Family Foundation, the Van Nuys Charities, and the Blue Shield Foundation of California. We are pleased to co-host this event in partnership with the LA County Domestic Violence Council. Countless children enter foster care due to allegations of domestic violence in the home. Often these allegations result in a finding of neglect for failure to protect. Yet removing children from their home and placing them in foster care for an isolated allegation of domestic violence can result in further trauma for both the survivor and the children and result in other harms, particularly in diverse communities of color. Our work examines this dilemma and the import of child safety coupled with the challenges of family separation. With support from the foregoing foundations, we have been engaged in research over the last year to explore the gaps in policy, practice, training, data collection, and cultural competency where domestic violence and foster care merge. This series highlights 4 areas where that intersection is particularly relevant. This is our final session in a series of 4. This session will examine how housing and domestic violence are interconnected, particularly with respect to family stability and the concept of failure to protect. Our learning objectives today are 1, to understand unique issues relating to the connection between domestic violence, child welfare, and housing. 2, to challenge biases about domestic violence and common beliefs about why survivors don't leave, especially where housing is at issue. And 3, to highlight unique methods and opportunities for offering housing to survivors and their children. We will now turn to the panel discussion. As a reminder, we are taking questions in the chat, which we will compile and attempt to address. This panel is generously moderated by Eve Sheedy. Eve is an attorney and the LA County Domestic Violence Council Executive Director. Information and contact info for the DV Council will be placed in the chat. Eve is a dear friend of the Pritzker Center, and we are thankful to have her join us today and for her ongoing partnership. Eve, I turn it to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Taylor. I just want to give just a very brief overview about the Domestic Violence Council. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and a special thanks to the UCLA Pritzker Center, who we work in partnership on this very critical issue of the connection between domestic violence and child welfare. The LA County Domestic Violence Council is actually two things with the same name. One is it is the coalition across LA County of people who are interested in domestic violence. So our coalition includes survivors, providers, both for people who are domestic violence survivors, but also for people who cause harm. There are government agencies, students, and importantly, you are all invited. We are open to the public. The more participation we have, the better. The more voices we hear and have in the room, the better our work is. We have a number of ongoing committees, including a committee on systems improvement, domestic violence and health, domestic violence and the LGBTQI plus community, a regional policy committee, a shelter directors committee, and importantly, a DV child welfare committee, which is building off of the work that Taylor mentioned to address locally what is going on in that connection with our Department of Children and Family Services. We are also, the DV Council is also a very small office within the Department of Public Health and the Health Promotion Bureau. As you all know, Department of Public Health is also sort of on the front line for the pandemic. So the Department of Public Health is a little bit stretched thin right now, but we're continuing our work. I just want to highlight one, and there will be in the chat, we have a daily digested email where we provide you with information both about the council and what's going on in DV. We'll put the address, or the address is actually in the chat. You can sign up for that by just sending us an email. We also have monthly meetings of both those committees and general meetings, and you will get those announcements. Finally, I just want to let people know, since 2016, we have, within the Los Angeles area, we've created a domestic violence homeless services coalition, which is separate from the DV Council, but I'm also been involved in that. It has really done remarkable work in trying to bring these two fields together, people who provide homelessness services and people who provide domestic violence services, and has given rise, frankly, to a lot of important changes in LA, including the appointment of a domestic violence coordinator at LASA and so forth. And we are actually sort of a national model that's used, our coalition, throughout the country about working to bring these two groups together. If you are interested in joining that coalition, I would recommend that you go on the Downtown Women's Center, Los Angeles Downtown Women's Center website, and there is a link to our coalition, or just write to the DV Council and I will make the connection for you. Okay, I'm going to stop talking because you didn't come here to listen to me. So I am going to ask the panel to introduce themselves now, starting with my dear friend, Barbara Kapos.
I'm going to unmute myself. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Just want to make sure, can you hear me? Yes? Okay. So yes, my name is Barbara Kapos and I'm the Executive Director of the East Los Angeles Women's Center. The East Los Angeles Women's Center was founded in 1976 as a bilingual rape hotline. Today, the East Los Angeles Women's Center is a leading voice and advocate for survivors and their families affected by sexual, domestic, and intimate partner violence, HIV, and the intersection of homelessness. ELAWC delivers innovative, comprehensive, culturally responsive services that build on a foundation of trauma-informed, evidence-based practices designed to heal, support, protect, and empower the communities we serve. In regards to housing solutions, our emergency shelter is based at LAC USC Medical Center, a unique setting where we as an organization can be first responders to those individuals that are in crises. Usually when someone comes through the hospital, they will meet with a social worker and possibly find a shelter or possibly most likely go back to the situation they were living in. This way, we are able to connect with that individual and provide shelter and emergency services to that individual who has been impacted by domestic or sexual violence. We also have a transitional house, which individuals can stay for 2 years while they create a path to a permanent housing. And one of our largest programs is housing services. We believe that if an individual wants to stay in their home, they should be given the resources and the ability to do that. So we use the housing first model in providing supportive services so that family can maintain their home environment. We appreciate the opportunity to be here today and look forward to this critical discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Patsy, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sorry, I am not very technologically advanced, so forgive me. My name is Patsy Moore, and I am a supervising attorney at Children's Law Center. We are a firm that represents children in dependency court, both in Monterey Park and in Lancaster. And we're also up in Sacramento and in Placer County. So we represent large numbers of foster children and children in the dependency court system. So we represent the children, and we are seeing the impacts of domestic violence, both the trauma of seeing the domestic violence, but then the next trauma of often being removed from their home and removed from both parents that often follows in the dependency system. And so we work with our clients and with parents' attorneys and DCFS. Our hope is to try to keep kids with at least one parent, because we all know that kids do better in families, and to try to keep the family in their housing if there's any way possible to do that safely. And I am very thankful and privileged to be here to join this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Danielle?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Just again, sent to as was stated by the others, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I enjoy being able to share and talk about these meaningful topics, to be able to work together to help our mutual clients. So again, my name is Danielle Rivera. I work at DCFS. I'm a supervising children's social worker at the Van Nuys office, and I oversee staff that work with families who have open cases. And our goal is to help them ideally successfully exit our system. And if not, for the kids that cannot reunify, to find permanency for them. I have been with the department for about 9 or so years, and I've done a little bit of different functions. And over the last couple of years, I found myself working more with a lot of our community partners in SPA 2 and a lot of the agencies, and finding, building relationships and partnerships with those, the domestic violence agencies within our SPA, to be more of a collaborative process versus DCFS working by themselves and then the agencies working by themselves, and that we're all serving the mutual clients. And so how is it that we build that bridge to really start to work together to effectively meet the needs of the clients that we mutually serve? So it's a little tidbit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just for those of you who are not from the Los Angeles area, DCFS is Department of Children and Family Services, and a SPA is what they call a service planning area, because they like to make things very confusing here. We have supervisory districts, and then we have 8 service planning areas, which are sort of on cross the supervisory districts in some instances, but a lot of the services that are delivered throughout the county are divided into these things called SPAs. It's very confusing. Okay, so Renee, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. My name's Renee Williams. I'm a senior attorney at the National Housing Law Project, We're based in San Francisco, but we are a nationwide organization. We have advocates who work in several places across the country, and we also work with legal aid attorneys, domestic violence advocates, and others across the country to help folks basically stay in their homes and access safe, decent, and affordable housing, which is really core to our mission. And with the COVID-19 crisis, a lot of what we've been focused on is really seeing that intersection between domestic violence, the uptick in domestic violence, folks needing to leave their homes when things are not normal right now, and just all of the different issues that have really been exacerbated during the pandemic. We do policy advocacy, training, technical assistance. If folks have questions specifically about the housing rights of survivors, which we'll talk about today, but if anybody wants to follow up, please email me. I'll drop my email in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you so much. What a fantastic panel. So we're going to go ahead and start. So the first question we have is, what do you see as the connection of housing and homelessness to domestic violence and child welfare? So I'm going to go in reverse order. So Renee, I'm going to call on you.
Great, thank you. I think that, for folks who do this work and who work in the housing space, I think folks have this understanding. There are varying statistics and figures out there, but I think there's general consensus that domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness. And so, when somebody doesn't feel safe in their homes, and that includes, survivors of children, it becomes a really untenable choice where you have survivors who are oftentimes making these calculations of, the extent to which I need to move for safety, and, with respect to survivors who have children, all of the disruptions that accompany that. And am I going to have safety versus am I going to have a place to live? And I think, particularly here in California, but across the country, the rising cost of housing and the lack of affordable housing options have made those decisions even harder for survivors. As I mentioned during my intro, there has been an uptick in reports of domestic violence during the pandemic. And unfortunately, survivors and their children are oftentimes evicted because of the abuse committed against them, whether it's criminal activity, whether it's the need to call for police or emergency assistance. And oftentimes during the pandemic, even though there's a lot of discussion about pause and eviction moratoriums, what doesn't get discussed is that in most cases, and this is across the country, and including the federal Centers for Disease Control eviction moratorium, there are exceptions, right, to those moratoriums, and one of which is criminal activity or activity that is disruptive to other tenants. And unfortunately, because of a lot of the institutional barriers that really hinder survivors, and I think Taylor alluded to this earlier, this sort of inner biases rather of why survivors stay in a particular situation. Oftentimes that criminal activity is equated with the activities of an abuser, and the entire household is evicted, which then sort of sets off a chain reaction and can place families in very precarious housing situations. So I'll stop there, and then if others want to add, or I'll toss it back to you, Barbara.
Barbara, you're muted.
You're going to have to keep reminding me of this. Okay. Domestic violence often forces women into poverty, which can lead to housing instability and subsequent homelessness. Survivors of domestic violence who are poor, single parents with limited financial means, isolated and alienated from a support system, are predictors for homelessness. We did a study in the East Los Angeles Women's Center. We did a study, an assessment study in 2020, and it was conducted with 4 focus groups. All of these individuals, survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, and all of them had become homeless at one point of their lives. Actually, a third of the women experienced chronic homelessness lasting 13 years. And how we integrate CPS or DCFS into this, and how sometimes because of that engagement, and we understand that that investigation may be because of a family who is living in a violent situation, needs to be investigated and look for the safety of that child. What happens sometimes in those situations is that because of this engagement, the victim of intimate partner violence is required to leave their home and move into a shelter. This sometimes has a long-term impact, resulting in chronic homelessness. Just today, we had a call from someone who's at one shelter. Because of their funding source, they can only stay there for a certain period of time, and they need to move by tomorrow, which then creates a problem for that family, because if she doesn't get into another shelter, then her child could be removed. So these are the kinds of situations that, you know, we were fortunate that we have a space and we can take this mother with her child so that doesn't happen. But in another scenario is when children are removed upon the onset of the investigation, survivors lose their cash aid, they lose housing assistance, and they're forced again into homelessness. And what happens to that family often, and these are cases we work with every day, is that there's a prolonged reunification period, and it's compromised, and families may be separated for years. And this is because of the poverty impacted on them and because of the isolation that I spoke about earlier. So I did want to just briefly talk about one case that was actually a great collaboration with the Department of Children and Family Services. During this pandemic, a mom who entered our shelter who was going to be reunified with her 4 children in March. And as we know what happened in March, she came into our shelter. She was not going to be reunified because of the pandemic and because the courts went dark. So what happened was, here she is in the shelter, moved there because she was required to go into a shelter in order to get reunified. And the worker could not reunify this mom because of the courts, but she became very connected to us as an organization and connected to this mom. And what she did is she created a opportunity for her to have an extended visit at our shelter, which lasted for about 3 months until the courts opened up. But what that did was those children were reunified with mom. And then finally, when the case was opened in court, she was reunified. But she's been with us for 7 months, something that was supposed to happen in a couple of months. So these are the, you know, I wanted to really share that story because I think it's important. There's ways to break through and create opportunities for families to be together, even in a situation such as this. So I'll pass it on to Danielle, maybe follow up with that.
No, that was excellent, Barbara. And I don't want to be too repetitive with a lot of things that you shared, but there are those barriers oftentimes when families come across and encounter our department. I do feel the need to just say that if a family were to become homeless in itself, we do not detain kids. That is not our role. We do our best to try to help them secure housing and get linked to services. But on the other end of that, we are extremely dependent on our community providers for those resources to be able to help our families so that we don't get to the point where we need to remove kids. But housing should not be the reason why a child is detained. The barrier and the struggle that the Department of Children and Family Services often has, like usually from the get-go, especially in the world of domestic violence, is if that home environment is too unsafe for those children and ultimately the victim as well, we do try to explore other options so that there can be some space between the perpetrator and the victim. Often the barrier comes into play is if there is nowhere for either to go. And legally, we are not allowed to ask a parent to leave if they're on the lease or on the contract with the landlord. So I can't say just because I got a detention and a warrant saying I'm allowed to remove the kids from the father, but mother's able to stay with the kids. If father's unwilling to leave, and I'm just using that as the example, if father's unwilling to leave the house, then the department then has to support and help the mother with the kids find somewhere else to go. Some of the struggles that we encounter with finding housing is that if mother doesn't have a job, doesn't have the financial means. And a lot of times with our immigrant families, they don't have social security numbers, they don't have a credit score, they're not able to go and locate housing. So then we do look to shelters. We partner a lot with 211 to see what shelters are available. And then we also, lastly, we'll see what support systems. Do they have a friend who's willing to take them in? Do they have a family member who's willing to take them in? And then on the reverse side, with the fathers who are the perpetrators who are willing to leave, they often experience homelessness too. They don't have anywhere to go. They can't pay the 2 rents. They'll resort to couch surfing, and then oftentimes we lose the connection. So to be able to hold, and that's important that we maintain the connection with both parents, because if father disappears, is unwilling to work with our department, how are we really ultimately going to work on ensuring child safety if both parties aren't doing what they need to do to mitigate the concerns that brought them to our attention in the first place? And so that's the frustration when we lose contact, because especially if the father's the perpetrator, we need to see what the changes and the growth is on that side, so that they don't end up in this cycle with our department. But we do our best. And so we do turn to shelters, we turn to families, and even DPSS at time for hotel vouchers, so that our families don't end up on the streets.
So Patsy, that leaves you to address the connection question.
All right, so we see the kids once they've been removed from one or both parents that come into the court, and we do see a intersection between the homelessness and the domestic violence. We have seen an uptick in domestic violence cases coming in. I think all of the stress of being at home together all the time with all the children is contributing. And so we're seeing some cases where it hasn't been a long history, but maybe there are some isolated incidents. But we also see those where there's been a significant history and people have been locked in those situations. And I think the victims then find themselves unable to leave for all the reasons that people have already talked about, that they don't have access to finances or money. They've been isolated from their family and friends and have no support system. Sometimes they've been moved here to California away from their family in their home state. Their self-worth has been battered so badly that they now believe that they aren't capable, perhaps, of leaving and taking the children with them. And so it's going to be vital to get services on the front end to try and keep them with the children. I've had a couple of cases where in one instance, mom had been battered for years. The kids were forced to videotape when father would batter her. They were forced to call mom the names that father called her. And this had been going on for about 5 years when finally police got involved. And she was fortunate in that she got immediate support through DCFS and was able to go to a shelter and get therapy and keep her kids with her to reduce some of the trauma to the kids so that they could all work through that. But in another case where there was a parent who had been basically not allowed to leave the home for years, the kids were removed from both parents in that case because the mother was attached to the father, didn't feel she could leave and be on her own. To try and so then mother and father don't have any income because they don't have the kids, as that you guys have mentioned. And so the trauma for the kids, and the parents are now homeless. They don't have the resources. And all of this just creates further victimization. And so just the cases where I've seen services come in immediately and sort of wrap around the victim and the children have been the ones that have been most successful at preventing homelessness and helping. And so I'm hoping that as we continue with policy work, we can move towards more of that.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for your thoughtful answers as well as the examples. So our second question is, what role does shelter play in preventing or mitigating against removal? And I'd ask that you look at it broadly, whether it be a DV shelter, a homeless shelter, or any other kind of shelter. Why don't we start with Danielle?
Yeah. I mean, in the role with the Department of Children and Family Services is extremely helpful. I mean, we view it as, to Patsy's point, is that wraparound. So when you go to a shelter, there's a lot of services that they automatically get linked to. There is some resistance often with families that we work with, and not wanting to go to a shelter, whether it's a homeless shelter or a domestic violence shelter, because it does mean that they might have to go to a completely different part of the county, leave the communities that they know, the schools that the kids go to. Often the kids will say that they don't want to move, so that really influences the parents. But from like a purely simplistic standpoint, if we're able to get them into a shelter where we have those extra eyes and we know that they're going to get that support system embedded by being a participant in the shelters, it does give us a little bit more peace of mind that, at least for that time being, that family is safer than the situation that they were in prior to going into that shelter. So we do look at that as a tool and a resource and a means to support the family, and hopefully so that they don't end up on the street, as well as to ensuring safety to a larger degree.
Thank you very much. Barbara? And if anyone wants me to repeat the question, just let me know.
Okay, so shelters can play a huge role in supporting families and keeping families together. I just want to start that we, usually talk about trauma informed and what does that really mean? Because I'm going back to our study, as Danielle said, many individuals do not want to enter a shelter. They feel like they're being monitored. Sometimes they feel re-victimized, and that's very uncomfortable and difficult for individuals to move forward when they're feeling these types of responses. So it's important that we as shelters not further victimize or impose really rigid rules and policies and procedures. I believe we are moving in that direction, but not all shelters embrace that, unfortunately. But it's important that we have safety check-ins and help our survivors with grounding techniques and access to economic autonomy and healthcare and therapeutic services. But I do want to go back to the study because one of the issues that was brought up was that the experiences accessing domestic violence was found difficult. Shelters that implemented strict guidelines were major barriers for victims who were facing homelessness. For example, shelters require that victims be in crises to gain admission. And that again is a funding source. It's a funding issue. It's not because shelters really want to require that, but it's part of their funding requirements. In some cases, the survivors sought shelters after leaving a friend's home, or one participant said, and I'm quoting her, "I stayed at the police station with my children for 15 hours. Then we went to a regular shelter in downtown Los Angeles for one night. It was humiliating. When I called the domestic violence shelters, I was told I didn't qualify. I have thought about returning to my abusive partner." And that's a reality. We have to create more flexibility, create an environment that really helps and embraces these families with their children, survivors with their children, and not re-victimize. I think we play an important role in the sense of creating strong relationships with the department, but at the same time, not being the police. I mean, sometimes, shelters are required to track families, where they're going, what they're doing. And I think that creates that rigid environment. We're there to help individuals heal and thrive and begin a new life without violence in their homes. So I think that it's possible, but we have to work harder at this. And should I pass it on to Patsy? How about that?
Okay. So this creates a real issue for removal when cases come into dependency court. If there isn't housing, if there isn't shelter, almost always the kids are going to be removed from both parents because of feeling that there is safety issue if in those instances. The cases where there are services up front that work with them and that are more of a carrot instead of a stick. Sometimes all of the requirements that are placed on a parent who is trying to get shelter, and it feels more like punishment than assistance. And if we could get more supportive services up front. The other thing we see is that you may have a mother who's a victim and the kids, and the department will give her a list of shelters. And instead of somebody trying to assist her to find something, they say, here's a packet, go find shelter. And if you have somebody who's been, beaten down and in a domestic violence situation, they may not have the competence or the confidence to be able to do that. They need some support and some assistance. So if we could get some kind of services on the front end to help get them into a shelter so that their kids can stay with them, and that it isn't just for a night, that they maybe can be there for a while, their kids can go to school. If they aren't having to travel around and leave the shelter during the day and then come back at night, if they're having to do that, they aren't going to be able to comply with the requirements that the court and DCFS is putting on them. They aren't going to be able to do the programs they need to do. So we need to get housing and shelter that's stable for the family and the kids. And like I said, I've seen cases in dependency court where the workers have gone above and beyond and helped, and it has made all the difference in the family being able to stay together. And we are so thankful for those workers that do that. If we could just get more of that, is what I would love to see. Thank you.
Thank you. Renee, I don't think you answered that question.
No, and and just because of the work that National Housing Law Project does. And just to pick up on Patsy's point, you know, of all of the barriers, right, to entry with shelters. And then we also see that in permanent housing as well, in terms of survivors who, you know, have experienced domestic violence. Maybe they've been evicted, and their families have been evicted. And now they have all of these downstream consequences to contend with. For example, bad credit, right? A lot of times they will have an eviction history. And the bad credit oftentimes stems from, you know, economic abuse and coercion. You know, it's very common for perpetrators and abusers to, you know, steal credit cards, steal identity, purposely withhold rent. And then you sort of see all of these downstream effects to where, you know, a housing provider who may be using a tenant screening, you know, database, or, you know, just get something spit back when the survivor goes to apply, says, you know, this person would not be a good tenant. There are some legal protections for lower income survivors who live in federally assisted housing programs, the Violence Against Women Act, which is an area that my organization focuses a lot on in terms of the housing rights of survivors, does provide both eviction protections for survivors and admissions protections for survivors. So, you know, for example, you know, survivors really shouldn't be denied public housing or a Section 8 voucher because of reasons stemming from the abuse. And so that's a lot of what we work on, to try and work with victim advocates to, you know, make housing providers understand that, you know, the consequences of being a survivor are many, and they come in many forms. And so it's not just, you know, I am a survivor, I am no longer, you know, the perpetrator has left the home and that's the end of it. So really dealing with a lot of those downstream consequences. And so, you know, when we're talking about barriers to shelter, I think as a parallel on the sort of permanent housing side, making sure that housing providers are educated and understand the dynamics of abuse, so that, you know, if a survivor is able to demonstrate that bad credit or bad rental history really stems from abuse, then
One second. Could everybody mute themselves, please? Somebody's not muted.
thanks, Eve. You know, just to, you know, both in the shelter system as well as in the more permanent housing, to really work to lower these barriers and get rid of these barriers, so that, you know, survivors can really have, you know, housing choice. They can move places where they might be in a more permanent situation. And, you know, so much of that also is survivors knowing their rights under, you know, various laws, both state, federal, et cetera. And, you know, so I think, you know, I think the common thread here is that there are too many barriers, and it really prevents survivors from accessing, you know, the housing options that they need for them and their families. So Eve, I'll toss it back to you.
So thanks to all for those answers, but and I think there was one reference to this, but I guess the follow-up question is it ever the case where the person who the abusive person is asked to leave the home, instead of forcing the survivor out and into sort of all of these barriers? Is that an experience I know someone referred to one of those, but what about that, looking at it through that kind of lens? Renee?
Sure. So, you know, in housing, I mentioned sort of VAWA protections for low-income housing that's funded by the federal government. actually provides for lease bifurcation, meaning that the survivor and her children remain in the housing, and then the perpetrator is removed from the lease so that they are no longer associated with the unit, and then the subsidy, the housing subsidy, is adjusted accordingly to reflect that smaller household size. So, this comes up, for example, in the Section voucher program. A survivor lives in a household that has a voucher. Say, the perpetrator is the head of household. Oh, sorry.
Well, there was a little bit of fuzz in sort of your talking, but I think it's okay. I apologize. Okay, so Renee, we've lost your sound. So I'm gonna just, does anyone else want to talk about that issue while we address Renee's tech issues about batterers being the people being asked to leave in lieu of the survivor? Maybe Danielle?
Yeah. I mean, just to touch on that. Oh, sorry, there's a bit of an echo. Our default is to ask the perp first. We always want to explore what that looks like, what's the capacity and understanding and the willingness of that person to be able to leave the house and respect the boundaries and rules of not being in the home in order to minimize the disruptions that the mother or the victim and the children would experience if they were displaced from their home. And as I kind of referenced earlier, the struggle that comes with that is that the batterer tends to be the father. It's not in every situation, but most often it is in the cases that we come across, and they tend to be the sole provider in the home. And so when they leave the home, a lot of the questions that come up is that, and a lot of our families in the area that my workers service are immigrant families where they don't have documentation, they don't have papers, they can't, a lot of times the apartments they secure are through word of mouth or through these like under the radar like contracts where it's just a mutual agreement. There's not actually a physical lease contract. So they don't want to lose that access to housing that they were able to secure when coming to this country. And one of the first questions always asked is that we do have a lot of the batterers who are willing to leave the home. But it's how are they going to pay for rent? How are they going to pay for 2 rents? How are they still going to be able to provide for their family if they're not in the home? And that they tend, and that's where it goes to where they struggle to find their own housing. They struggle to be able to afford, and then they end up couch surfing. We do try to give referrals for shelters for the perpetrators, but often they don't want to go. And to Patsy, to one of your points that you referenced about that, like that initial like wrapping around the family with services, I would love that to be the case. And I would love that to be able to be the scenario. Oftentimes when we do help to call 211, there aren't openings in shelters. There aren't opening in homeless shelters for whoever is being asked to leave the home or to move to a new location. And then even so, a lot of the homeless shelters, they can only stay there at night and they have to leave during the day, and they're constantly having to move and to stay on top of finding where they're going to sleep night after night after night. So there are a lot of struggles on our end to be able to immediately put those services in place and wrap the family around. And a lot of it is just there's limitations into what's out there and what's available to our families to be able to, from the get-go, link them and get them on a healthier path. So thanks.
Barbara, Patsy, Renee, you want to add anything to that question?
In terms of asking the perpetrator to leave the home, we do see that fairly often, and often they do leave the home. The problem, as other panelists have indicated, is the finances are often controlled by the perpetrator and may be low income to begin with. So their ability to pay for 2 houses are it's not feasible. I had a couple of cases where the father moved out, mom and the kids stayed in the home, and the father, so he could continue to pay the rent where mom and the kids were, slept in the car in the driveway. And then that becomes an issue because mom is allowing father to sleep in the driveway and not requiring the father to leave the property. So I agree with Danielle, when we've tried to work with people to try and find shelter, it's really often difficult to find something that has an opening that will take either the perpetrator or and we keep, I know, and one of the other programs when they were talking about the person who was committing the violence, that they wish not to be called batterers or perpetrators. They would like to have, that they're the father who are whoever has committed the violence. But because of the issues that we often can't find them housing or family as well. And certainly if mother has more than one or two children, that can be an issue too, to find a shelter that can accommodate a number of children if mother's going to have to move out. If we could get like family preservation or somebody in who can help perhaps with some rent or that kind of thing, but that always takes time and weeks, and often, they've lost their place by the time we're able to get those in place. So it is a real concern and a real issue.
I'll just add that, of course, this is a critical issue and children's safety is priority. However, sometimes we move too fast. In all cases, this individual may not be a perpetrator, but that they have a very unhealthy relationship. And there are pilot projects, and we've started to engage some of these projects around using restorative justice with families so that they can stay together and create a healthy environment for themselves and their children. So there are some other options other than separating everyone. And I think that it's time that we start to look at those models that are being implemented here in California, actually. We work closely with the National Compadres Network, and we provide groups for men who have been harm doers and were referred from their partners because they do want to come back together. And it's essential that we really look at this family as a whole, if that's what they want. I think sometimes we're too quick to make decisions for everyone, and the decision should lie with the family. And how can we support them in becoming a healthy, united family, if that's a possibility? And I say that strongly because restorative justice approaches and what we do with the National Compadres Network is a commitment to that family needs to commit to that program and work together along with their extended family. So I just want to put that out there. That doesn't really answer the question around the shelter piece, but it's kind of the core issue that we need to address at some point.
Barbara, I'm just going to ask you if you could very briefly just add a little bit about the restorative justice program that you're working with in that setting, because that's such a innovative program.
Another session here, but basically, you do assess the level of violence in that family. That's important. That those individuals want to work towards creating a safe and healthy environment, and that the facilitators are trained to know this approach. And actually, I know Blue Shield is one of the agency or foundations that have supported some of these pilot programs throughout California. So I would, definitely, suggest that the agencies that are on this call look at some of the outcomes of those pilot programs, but also what's important about the restorative justice approach And they're different models, so I can't, and they're throughout the United States, there's different models that are being used around this. And it can be controversial because some don't believe in this, right? But extended family becomes a part of that dialogue. And so everything's on the table. And you're in usually a circle setting, and facilitators are trained to do this work. And the individuals are confronted many times around the issues that has impacted them and their children. So it's a lot of hard work, but at the end of the day, if it does work, you have kept this family together. And because even if you remove dad from the home or mom leaves, at some point, children want to know their parents. And if this is an opportunity that families can have, then I think that we need to focus on this a little bit more than we have.
Thank you, Barbara. So the final question, and we're sort of coming towards the end. There's a few questions in the chat box. So I'm going to ask a question, but also ask you if you have any sort of specific things you've wanted to say. In child welfare cases, how does housing become an issue in reunification? So you've touched on that to some degree, but if you could give a little bit more specifics. I'll start with you, Danielle.
Yeah, in short, I'd like to say it's not a barrier to reunification. The lack of housing when we're at that point, but often we're also looking at stability for the family. And I think that it comes across often that, like, if they're not in secure housing, how are they going to be able to provide and meet all their kids' needs, especially if the kids are higher needs? And is there going to be stability if they're moving from hotel to hotel, or moving from family member to family member? So in short, it can be a barrier, but I'd like to think that it's not, and to be able to connect the family to additional resources. We do have partnerships with 211 and a lot of our community domestic violence shelters, and that we do try to reach out to them directly to see if they have openings. The problem with 211 that we often encounter, which is we go through them and we partner with homeless agencies to help secure housing, is that when parents are undocumented and don't have any type of paperwork, or to someone mentioned too, if they have a long eviction history or bad credit, it takes a long time for, even when they are linked to these housing services, to convince landlords that it's worthwhile taking a risk on this potential tenant in the long run. So I mean, a lot of tenants will reject it because just by the mere fact that they're participating in the service, they don't think that they're going to be a good candidate and someone who's going to be able to pay their rent on a regular basis. Because a lot of these programs, the way it works is that they'll pay the deposit, they'll pay first months, and then they do a percentage and they slowly wean off the family until they're able to pay the full rent on their own. However, a lot of the landlords have fears that when that time comes, they won't be able to pay their full rent. So they don't want to take the risk of offering their housing to our clients. And so that becomes an additional barrier. DPSS does have family reunification services too. Well, that includes a component for housing. So if we were to detain children and the parent, whoever is eligible for the family reunification services through DPSS, they are able to have a case manager that will help locate housing and even motel vouchers if that's the case and they can't find housing. So we try to do this stuff at the beginning so that when the time comes and they're ready to reunify, that's not a barrier. But there have been instances, I can't cite specific examples because luckily it hasn't. A lot of times families turn to other families or friends that are able to take them in. So we've been lucky in a lot of those cases, but it's hard to send kids back to something when the parents don't have a place for the kids to go to, in short.
Thank you. Renee, you want to address that question?
I don't really have anything more to add to that piece. But, you know, I do think Just, I'm just monitoring the chat, and, just also wanted to acknowledge the last comment that was made about, this disproportionately impacting poor people of color, and, Black women in particular, studies have shown have really borne the brunt of eviction. So I just wanted to mention that and just acknowledge that as well. But I don't have anything to add to that last question. So thanks, Eve.
Patsy?
Yes, a lack of housing has been a real barrier to reunification. I've been with CLC over 13 years now, and I have seen numerous cases over the years where the parent has completed all of their programs, their counseling, their parenting, their DV classes, but they don't have housing, and they can't get housing. They can't get because they don't have custody of their kids, they can't access some housing until they get custody. And the court won't give them custody until they have housing. And so it has been a real issue and a real barrier to reunification for many, many families. And the result is sometimes that parents almost give up and don't follow through then, and we don't get the kids reunified with the parents. We need to look, I agree, I echo what everyone else has been saying about at the beginning of the case, we need to look at what our biases are in terms of why are we removing from both parents here, and what can we do to get them keep them in housing at the front end, so that because once the kids are removed from the parent and they don't have access to perhaps some funding sources that come because they have custody of the kids, they can't access the housing. You have the problems with the evictions, the lack of documentation, all of that. So we need to look at I think we all need to look at the policies on the front end as to why we remove from this family and not that family, and what kind of biases are going into that, whether it's cultural or racial bias or just as to domestic violence families. It is a real barrier, and we need to work on what programs can we get families into so that if they don't have custody, that we can get them returned to the family so they can get custody. We also sometimes have asked that the court return custody to the parent, but the children not return immediately to them so that they can get, or to make an order that if the parent gets housing, the children will be in their custody, to try to facilitate some of those programs that require the parent to have custody to get the children returned. But it is a significant problem.
Barbara, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, there's so much said here, and I don't want to repeat any of it. Thank you very much. But I would just say that the ironic thing is that many times at the time of removal, we have now caused homelessness. And then in order to reunify, they need to find housing again. And so we need to, reflect on that a little bit. I also, from a point of view from a domestic violence organization and shelter, is that we need the flexibility to work with families on a long term. This funding that permits you only to work with family for 6 months, has all these barriers, is not conducive to helping families reunify. So fortunately for us, we've had a lot of foundation funds, and that has created an opportunity for families to reunify while they're at the shelter and then look for permanent housing. So I think that we just need to change the way we do business. And our goal should be that if families are to be reunified, that every effort is made on all our parts to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Taylor, I'm going to turn it to you because of the timing and so forth.
Thank you so much, Eve. I really want to thank our participants today. We've heard such great insights, and I also want to thank everyone who's been contributing in the chat. It's been a very robust conversation to partake in, and we really appreciate the expertise and insights that our participants have shared. I will close our session today by asking our panelists to please share a bright spot that you have seen with regard to a housing option or a promising policy in the housing sector relating to domestic violence and its connection to child welfare. And let's start with Renee.
You know, I think more broadly, I think one sort of issue or something that has become more prominent, and I could speak specifically to the pandemic itself, is that folks sort of acknowledge, one, that housing stability is equivalent to healthcare, and being able to have a safe, decent, and affordable place to live, you know, is really just foundational for people's health, for children's development, for all of these different intersections, and that we need to specifically be more attuned to the housing needs of survivors and enabling survivors and their families to, you know, to relocate and relocate safely. So that's my bright spot.
Let's go to Barbara.
Okay, I'm going to try to find a bright spot here. Okay, I think that with the change of administration, there's some real possibilities of change. Prior to coming onto this, the National Alliance to End Homelessness had a webinar on the changes that could possibly be made through that administration, and I'll put that in the chat. I think there's some hope in the horizon. And the only thing that worries me, of course, is that domestic violence is at the table. Many times it's not. And we know that on a local level and on a federal level. So I think that's up to all of us on this webinar today to make sure that we're at the table and that we address the issues that we discussed today as they prepared, you know, new policies.
Sorry, let's go to Danielle.
Oh, I was confused with the button that popped up.
Sorry, Danielle.
No. I guess the bright spot is just being able also to have these conversations, to sit as a group and as a team and as a community, really take a deeper dive and look into what are the barriers to supporting and helping our families so that kids don't linger and end up in foster care system, because we know that the foster care system is not an adequate parent. And at the end of the day, these kids and their parents deserve an opportunity to be an intact family. So I find hope and optimism in having these open dialogues so that we get to share information. I mean, there's things from people on this panel that I didn't know were going on out there. So now it's stuff that I can take back to my office, to my team, to my peers, and kind of share what's going out there, what's going on out in the community, so that we can look at our practice as a department and really see how we can evolve and support families from a different perspective, in hopes that they stay together.
Thanks so much, Danielle. We appreciate that. And I think you're so spot on that we have so much to learn and really need to be more intersectional in our thinking when it comes to servicing our families. Let's close it with Patty, or excuse me, Patsy. I'm so sorry.
Patty is fine. I would just echo what they have said, especially what Danielle has said. I think my bright spot has been these programs where people from all avenues that work with this have been contributing. And I think that this is going to need a collaborative effort to look at all the different aspects from the policies to how we actually implement them and how we get the funding to support those programs. So the fact that people are seeming to come together and from all different areas and work together for that has been a real bright spot for me.
Thank you so much, Patsy. And with that, that concludes our panel discussion. Let's all thank our amazing speakers for their contributions today, as well as Eve for her incredible moderation skills. She's been with us 4 times throughout this session and really done a great job. So thank you, Eve, and thank you, speakers. We really appreciate you. Before we conclude, I would like to share with our audience that we are hosting a summit on domestic violence and child welfare in May. If you'd like to receive notifications about that event, please sign up at the link in the chat. We invite your feedback on today's event. Please complete our brief anonymous survey. The link is in the chat. This series will conclude with today's session, but as I mentioned, we have our summit forthcoming, as well as a report on the connection of domestic violence and child welfare, and we invite you to engage with us in that effort. Lastly, we invite you to visit our website and follow up with us on social media, which will be placed in the chat. Please contact me with any questions, comments, or feedback. We really do invite the engagement of the community and would love to hear from you. So I'll be placing my email in the chat, and you're welcome to reach out to me anytime. With that, thank you again to all of our speakers, to everyone who joined. We're really honored by the outreach and engagement of so many people in this series, and we think it speaks to the need of further education, information sharing, and in particular improvement with regard to the connection between domestic violence and child welfare from a policy and practice standpoint. So we really invite all of you to join us in this ongoing conversation. And thank you to those of you who have been having it for years and years and years. We recognize that at UCLA Pritzker, we are in large part new to the scene, and that many of you have been doing this work for far longer than we've even been around. And we thank you to that end for having us as a partner in this work. Thank you again to everyone who joined us, and best wishes, stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.